Turning now to our speaker, Paul Hanley, has done some really quite interesting things here. Paul has published 5 books, and I'll talk about a few of them, 1,600 articles on the environment, sustainable development, agriculture, and other topics. He's been an environmental columnist for the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix until 2016. He's been the recipient of quite a few different awards: the Canadian Environment Award, the Meewasin Conservation Award, the Organic Connections Pioneer Organic Communicator Award, the Saskatchewan Sustainability Award from the Regional Center of Excellence for Education on Sustainable Development. He's, of course, published several books people have heard of, one of which, of course, is this one, 11, which came out a few years back, and we have a Wilmette Institute course about that one. Today, he's going to be talking about Richard St. Barbe Baker, and of course, he has a book about St. Barbe Baker, who recently came out. And as if all these books aren't enough, he's even written a book for children about Richard St. Barbe Baker, The Child of the Trees. And if you're interested in obtaining a copy of this, the Baha'i Publishing Trust has a 20% discount coupon. You just go to the Wilmette Institute website, wilmetteinstitute.org, click on webinars, come to the webinar for this particular webinar today, and you can find the discount code, 20% discount code for getting the Child of the Trees. So quite a few opportunities there. And I should add also that the book on Richard St. Barbe Baker has a foreword by His Royal Highness Prince Charles and an introduction by Jane Goodall. So we are really quite excited to have Paul joining us today from warm Molokai, having fled Saskatchewan for some time. And he's also, of course, interested in figuring out how the Hawaiians were doing agriculture there as well. He's been working on that whole question as well. So it's quite an interesting set of projects that Paul has been tackling. But today he'll be telling us about Richard St. Barbe Baker. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul. Thank you for joining us. We're very grateful, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
So I will share some slides with you about this remarkable human being, the man of the trees, as he was called. And I'm very fascinated in my life, the intersections between the Baha'i teachings and the science around the environment, agriculture, forestry, and so on. And of course, Richard St. Barbe Baker was onto this 100 years ago. And so let's talk about his life a bit. So yeah, born in 1889, when Baha'u'llah was still alive, and lived up till he was 92 years old, and devoted his whole life to the conservation of forests and replanting forests. And he was given this title of the world's greatest conservationist by one of the world's greatest conservationists, Stuart Udall, who was Secretary of the Interior in the United States under the Kennedy administration. And so he did have a certain amount of recognition in his life. When the World Wildlife Fund formed in 1969, they made him their first member of honor of the World Wildlife Fund. So he did have some of this recognition during his lifetime. And why? Because he was a real visionary pioneer, but in many, many fields he was a first. So, many of the things we talk about today, like rainforest conservation, well, back in the 1920s, he was on it. Sustainable development, the situation of smallholder farmers around the world, the mass migrations of populations being displaced by environmental problems. He was talking about it. Grassroots development, reclaiming the deserts, biodiversity, indigenous culture and rights, agroforestry, agroecology, all of these things and many more. He was kind of onto many of the kind of big trends and movements in environmental thinking today and in transformative thinking around culture. He was a pioneer. So that's why he's received quite a bit of recognition. But we'll just look a bit at his roots. And he really had this kind of critique of social change, and it combined in many ways with his spirituality. And I was thinking perhaps there's maybe 4 foundations of his spirituality. And the first one is Christian millennialism. These are his parents here on the left, and his father was a lay preacher. His parents were very involved in a kind of millennial movement in Christianity, where there was expectations about the return of Christ. And they had the father was a nurseryman. For a living, he grew and sold trees to people, horticultural trees. And also he had in his yard built a chapel and would invite people in. And it was kind of a sort of a universal thinker. He would invite people of all faiths to come and share with him the message of Christ. And then this is a picture of Richard and his sister. And you can kind of see in this little boy in his sailor suit how he's kind of ready to take on the world. And he's quite a character even as a little child. So this second spiritual foundation, I think, was kind of almost a mystical relationship he developed with trees and forests. And it started when he was 5 years old. He was living in a place in Britain that was surrounded by forest. And one day he went into the forest against the admonitions of his parents for a little walk, and he got lost in the forest. But the interesting thing he writes about it is he didn't feel lost, and he finds this lovely clearing in the forest where the light's streaming in, and he has almost a mystical, I guess you would say, experience of kind of uniting with the trees, and he feels really kind of fulfilled and completely safe. And then this experience stayed with him for his entire life. It was kind of a foundation to his spirituality. And he had, afterwards, he found his way out back home and got into a bit of trouble, but that was okay. Then, as a young man, he decided to, go west, young man, and to go, of all places, to Saskatchewan in Western Canada. And in 1909, he landed here in Saskatchewan and homesteaded at Beaver Creek, which is just outside of Saskatoon. And he wasn't a very good farmer, I don't think. He really had a hard time. It involved kind of plowing up the land and knocking down the trees and bushes, and he couldn't stand doing that. So he never, what they call, proved his homestead. Homestead, you have to make a certain amount of improvements, so to speak, to the homestead, and he didn't do that. Interestingly, Beaver Creek today is the center, it's a center of, it's a conservation center and an educational center for children on ecology. And he goes to the University of Saskatchewan, which just opened. He's one of its first students, and he's studying theology towards becoming a minister. And he spends a lot of his time traveling by horseback out to different parishes out in the country of new settlers and serving them. But then he connects up with his neighbors, which are members of the Whitecap Dakota First Nation, which was surrounding the place that he lived at that time. And I found this old picture in the archives at the Saskatoon Library, and it actually has a picture of Charlie Eagle, who's winding up that car, cranking up the car to start it with a bunch of his friends. And on horseback behind is a person, and I sort of fantasized that's Richard St. Barbe Baker, because he was a horseman and he used to trade horses and train horses and so on to make a living. But Charlie Eagle became a very close friend and kind of trained Baker in understanding Indigenous culture and philosophy. And Baker always talked about how this kind of opened up his mind to ways of thinking about spirituality, but also about ecology and the natural world. So he had this close association with these people that was important throughout his life. And so they have, different ceremonies and so on. interestingly, one of their key ceremonies has this Sundance Lodge, Rain Dance Lodge, and has a central tree as part of the ceremony. So focus on trees again in this culture too. Then to earn some more money, he becomes a lumberjack in northern Saskatchewan. Quite an experience. And at one time in Big River where he worked, it had the largest sawmill in the British Empire. And there he saw for the first time this kind of very wasteful forestry practices, the harvesting without replanting and so on, and became very alarmed about forestry conditions. He decided to leave Saskatchewan and go back to England and go to forestry school. He went to Cambridge University. That's him on the sitting on second from the left. This is actually a reunion of forestry school members. I found this picture. But this is where he learns the science of forestry before he joins the colonial service and goes off to Africa. And he becomes conservator of forests, or assistant conservator of forests, in both Kenya and Nigeria, and spends the 1920s in Africa, in these two countries, and traveling in other countries as well. And he discovers that really his role is supposed to be conservator of forests, but he's given no budget. His real job, he finds out, is actually to assist in the exploitation of the forests. And he starts to develop this consciousness of protecting the environment, protecting the forests, and starts to be concerned about replanting. And while he's there in Kenya, initially, he starts, in his travels, he starts to witness the early desertification in the Sahel region up in the north. And the Sahara Desert is starting to move south. So he starts to see some of the big problems that we're facing, such as the first waves of environmental refugees. And this has become a major problem in the world. Something like 70 million people displaced from their homes today, partly because of environmental conditions. And he starts seeing this and realizing we have to do something different. So how do you do it? He needs to get people, he realizes, involved, because he has no budget from, to hire foresters and so on to replant the forests that are being torn down in Africa. So he says the way to do it is to create a grassroots movement. He goes to the Kikuyu chiefs, the tribe that he's most associated with, says, let's plant trees. And they say, no, that's God's business, tree planting. And he says, yeah, but the way things are going, we have to help God. So how do we do it? And the elders say, well, everything we do involves a dance. So you have to start a dance of the trees. And he started this movement, the dance of the trees. It got people involved in a dance that led to, kind of building a cultural context for tree planting. And this is actually the very first Dance of the Trees in 1922. There are thousands of people present, thousands of people involved. And this is also the start of the group organization, the Men of the Trees, which he forms with the chief Njaya Njonjo. And together they form this movement, which starts there in Kenya and eventually builds throughout the world. And so, yes, this very interesting kind of building a cultural grassroots connection between these people's mode of storytelling and dance and arts and so on, and the environment. And he is very respectful of Indigenous culture, and he says the first white man who was initiated into the secret society of Kikuyu elders, and that's his stick that he was given as a member of this order. And the Prince of Wales talks about St. Barb's sort of prescience about the connection between spirituality and life in the forests and so on, and how Indigenous people had this sensibility, which was now being really discovered by new sciences like ecology and silviculture. So in his breaks, when he'd go back to England, he started movements like the the branches of the Men of the Trees. For example, in Britain, here he is speaking to a group, encouraging them to plant trees. And I don't know if this is correct or not, but as far as I know, this might be one of the first, if not the first, international ENGOs, environmental non-governmental organizations in the world. So he launched it in Kenya, then Britain, and next in Palestine. And we talked about different spiritual foundations. The fourth one, I think, is encountering the Baha'i Faith. So in 1924, there was a British Empire exhibition at Wembley in England, and he was asked to give a talk on African religions. So he gave this talk about, what he saw as the truths of African religion. And after his talk, a woman named Claudia Skipworth-Coles came up to him and said, "You are a Baha'i." And he said, "What is that?" And she said, "You value the other person's religion as much as your own." And he said, "Well, that's true." And she gave him some books. They became lifelong friends, and he began to inquire into the Baha'i faith and gradually identified with it. So in Africa, he got into a lot of trouble because he was too sympathetic with the indigenous population of the Africans. And on one occasion, an African officer was going to strike a blow on an English officer was going to strike a blow on an African worker. And St. Barbe Baker jumped in between them and took the blow, and it broke his collarbone. And the Africans were very appreciated very much what he had done. It was a very unusual thing to do for anyone to stick up for their side. But it ended up that and other attitudes that St. Barbe Baker had ended up him not being accepted in the colonial service. He left Africa at the end of the 20s. He was invited by the governor of Palestine to come and try to support tree planting there. And this is a picture of children involved in a festival of the trees, which he helped to revive. And it's kind of a funny story. He was asked to support tree planting, and what was saw was that all the different religious factions in Palestine hated each other and would never cooperate. So he thought, how can I bring them together? And what he did was he decided to invite all the religious leaders, but they wouldn't meet with each other. So he hired a hall, and in this hall had a bunch of alcoves with curtains. So he invited one to come at 9 o'clock, one to come at 9:15, one at 9:30, and so on. And he'd bring them in and usher them into an alcove and close the curtain until they were all in their alcoves. And when they were all there, he pulled the curtains apart, and there they were all in the same room. And then he very quickly gave this eloquent speech about how they had to work together to plant trees and restore the environment, and inspire them all to become the co-directors of the Men of the Trees of Palestine. And so that started. And just an interesting little snippet that Israel was one of 2 countries in the world with more trees at the end than at the beginning of the 20th century. And obviously not all about St. Barbe Baker, but he played this a kind of an interesting role in this process. And when he was in Palestine, actually the very first thing he did was to go visit the guardian of the Baha'i Faith, Shoghi Effendi, the leader of this world faith. This is a picture of Shoghi Effendi working on his little typewriter. I love this picture. And the guy, when he arrived in Haifa to meet the guardian came out of the house and immediately handed him an envelope, and in it was his membership. He became the first life member of the Men of the Trees. And throughout the guardian's life, he always supported St. Barbe Baker's work for conservation, and would often send telegrams to Baker and to leaders and so on, supporting his conservation work. And this is a little pamphlet with the vice presidents of the Men of the Trees of Palestine that he took the liberty of appointing, all the big leaders of the different religions. So back in England, Baker became very involved with the Baha'i community as well. And here he is at an English Baha'i summer school. And maybe you recognize some of these pictures. I think in the front row is Hossein Balozi, who was one of the people who were instrumental in really teaching Baker more about the Baha'i faith. And here he is, I think, with Hand of the Cause Townsend and others in this picture. And St. Barbe Baker took this same idea of summer schools, and he had the first summer school of the Men of the Trees, 1938. And you can see Baker, this is a Tony affair. These guys are all dressed up. You can see the women in their fur stoles and so on. And Baker, the second row at the front, in his tux. And he was very much into bringing aristocrats into the conservation movement because they had land and forests, and he would often work for them and help them design their forest plans for their lands. And the Men of the Trees actually grew to become active in 108 countries. It had 5,000 members in its heyday. And Baker often mentioned that when he combined his work for the Baha'i movement and conservation, his efforts would be strengthened, his conservation efforts would be strengthened. And he did many, many services for the faith. For example, there was one story about he was in Sweden and he got a message came from Martha Root. She was to meet the King of Sweden and give him a message from Shoghi Effendi and give him Baha'u'llah in the New Era and acquaint him with the faith. And she was very, very ill. And so he went to her bedside and she asked him to do this task. And St. Barbe Baker did go see the king and gave him the books on the Baha'i Faith, told him about the Baha'i Faith, but also threw in a few words about the importance of tree planting and conservation in Sweden. And so he combined these efforts together. Basically, from 1929 to the end of his life, he went on this worldwide campaign and traveled pretty much ceaselessly from place to place, giving talks and broadcasts and spreading the gospel of tree planting, forest conservation. He was very interested in Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he was governor of New York. And you can see this picture. It says, "To my friend Richard St. Barbe Baker, from his fellow man of the trees, Franklin Roosevelt." And Baker talked to him about the idea of employing people during the Depression years in forestry. And indeed, when he became president, President Roosevelt started the Civilian Conservation Corps, millions of people involved in conservation, including forestry planting, shelter belts, and so on. And so this is part of the New Deal. And I guess now they're talking in the United States about the New Green Deal. So Baker, is sometimes credited with starting the Civilian Conservation Corps, but really he was one of a number of people who did support this and kind of expand a larger project than initially imagined. He was very involved in the conservation efforts to save the redwoods in California. Baker would go there frequently and consider this sort of the ultimate forest, the ultimate tree, and wrote this book called The Redwood, one of 30 books that he wrote all on trees. And he became a big fundraiser for the redwoods conservation and was involved in that for many decades. Lowell Thomas, who was a major broadcaster in the United States, NBC's World News in the 1930s. He heard about Baker's work, and he was the first person to call him the man of the trees. He had popularized Lawrence of Arabia, and he sort of characterized Baker as Lawrence of Africa as well for his work in Africa, and would have him on his radio shows. He was also involved in many other movements. He was a lifetime vegetarian, supported the World Vegetarian Congress, and he started something called the World Forestry Charter Gatherings in 1943. There was a movement in place during the Second World War to think about forming the United Nations. And Baker said this would be a good way to get them to start thinking about a global forestry charter. And so he brought all the ambassadors that he could find in England to come together and have these World Forestry Charter gatherings where he asked them to do a survey of forestry in their country and how we could build a global kind of picture of forestry. And he held these every year for 15 years. And the Guardian each year would send a cable recommending them to continue this important work and to kind of take a global view of Earth's ecosystems. And in 1990, the Universal House of Justice reconvened this group a couple of times to continue this process of building this kind of discourse around a global view of trees. In 1949, he wrote this New Earth Charter. Today we have the Earth Charter, which took about 15 years to write and has been endorsed by many world leaders. I think President Gorbachev was a major figure involved in writing the Earth Charter. But back in 1949, Baker had already written a kind of a charter, which was a very interesting document. So again, this involvement in this public discourse. Then in 1952, he believed that there was this incredible potential to restore the Sahara Desert. And he believed the Sahara Desert had been a forest, and he decided to prove it by driving across the Sahara from Morocco to Uganda. And in this vehicle, this secondhand Humber vehicle, and he drove across with a small group. And in the middle of the forest, he would find, or this desert, he found tree stumps and so on, various signs of this had once been forested. The purpose that we unite East and West. And he, for example, made this diagram and showed how big the Sahara Desert is by drawing the continent of Australia. So he said we could basically add a whole continent to the world if we could restore this landscape and feed this burgeoning world population that they were seeing in the 1950s. So he was a real kind of master at social marketing. Before he left, he did radio broadcasts and so on. And one of the things he said was, asked everybody to bring it was peach season in England, bring your peach pits to Trafalgar Square. I will plant them as I travel through the Sahara Desert. And hundreds of people came out and did just that. So he would get all kinds of publicity for his efforts. There he is in front of his vehicle as he starts off across Africa. And in the middle of the Sahara, fossilized tree stumps and so on, many, many interesting experiences on that very treacherous trip across Africa. And while he was there, he proposed this idea of a great green wall. So there would be a green wall planted across the Sahara, almost 8,000 kilometers long, that would stop the expansion south of the desert in the Sahel region. So he promoted that idea, and for many years he would travel around the African nations and promote it, but no one would listen to him. During this first excursion across the desert, he had planned it so that he could attend the Kampala Teaching Conference in 1953, which one of the conferences launching the 10-year crusade. And the Guardian asked him to attend to the African delegates to the conference. So many of these people you see are pioneers from other countries. And St. Barbe would go out in his vehicle and bring in African delegates from where they were staying and make sure they were there and looked after at the conference. And he maintained this long connection with Africa. Here he is, the conference, the first World Conference on Desertification was held interestingly, very close to where the first Dance of the Trees was held in 1922. And here he is, the Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai and Chief Josiah Njonjo planting a tree at that first conference. So there's kind of this heritage. Wangari Maathai becomes a much more successful at engaging Africans in Kenya in this tree planting campaign, but very much appreciated St. Barbe's early work. And her daughter, Wanjira, who is now the chair of Kenya's Greenbelt movement, talks about how Richard St. Barbe Baker had foreseen the issues that they're facing today in terms of environmental degradation and how he was appreciated for that work. And in fact, although in his lifetime, this Great Green Wall didn't take shape, it now is taking shape, and it is being, different nations have come together to build this Great Green Wall, and it's starting to take shape in different parts of Africa. And when completed, if and when completed, it would be, I guess some say, the single greatest, largest human artifact, this huge shelter belt right across Africa. Oops. Sorry about that. Just having a little problem. There we go. And so interestingly, I first wrote this book, the manuscript for this book in the 1980s about St. Barbe, and I never really completed it. But one of the upsides of taking so long was I found out about all of these people who had been inspired by Richard St. Barbe Baker and become great tree planters, like this Tony Ronaldo, who was an Australian farmer. And he, as a young man, was visiting a neighbor and on his farm and saw an old shed with a bunch of books in it. On top of this pile of books, he found Sahara Challenge by Richard St. Barbe Baker, just serendipitously picked it up. It inspired him to become a forester. And he pioneered a method of forest reclamation in West Africa 30 years ago, and they've replanted 6 million hectares of forest using this methodology, which he attributes to the vision of Richard St. Barbe Baker. So there are several people. Scott Poynton, he said around his 15th birthday, he heard a radio talk on Australian radio from Richard St. Barbe Baker, who was 90 years old at the time, decided to become a forester. It changed his life. And he went on to form the Forest Trust, which actually has been instrumental in changing the whole furniture trade in the world towards sustainably managed forest products. So it has had a huge influence on him, who's making a big difference. And this man, Vance Martin, who's the president of WILD, he is one of the people that's the concept of half for Earth, 50% of the Earth should be in conservation lands. And he, again, attributed his work in the area of forestry to his associate, St. Barbe Baker. And so later in life, St. Barbe became pretty frustrated with adults and started to shift his attention to children, and eventually formed an organization called Children of the Green Earth, which never really took off, but he worked with children for his whole life. He'd been trying to inspire children to get involved in conservation. In the early 1960s, he married for the second time and moved to New Zealand with plans of retiring. But he couldn't stand being retired, and his wife had given him a horse for his wedding present, and he decided, oh, I think I'll take a 1,200-mile ride on horseback across New Zealand from top to bottom. and stop at all the schools. And he stopped and talked to something like 15,000 children about tree planting. Interestingly, I've given talks in New Zealand, and somebody told me they were actually they were now, of course, kind of my age or something, but they were a child who had met Richard St. Barbe Baker way back when and were inspired by his talks. And so Baker maintained this interest in children. He had always wanted to go to China, which he saw as a champion of tree planting and reforestation. He started to learn Chinese when he was in his late 80s, and he had this plan of riding across the Gobi Desert on a Mongolian pony to, kind of bring attention to Gobi Desert and to its reforestation and so on. So here he is. He finally made it to China when he was 91 and worked with kids there to plant trees. He also inspired this young man, Felix Finkbeiner, a very amazing kid. When he was a little child, I think he was in grade school, and he was given the task of writing a paper about something that he was interested in. And he explored the stories of Wangara Maathai, who I mentioned before, and Richard St. Barbe Baker, and decided he'd better do more than just write a little paper about tree planting. And he decided to found an organization called Plant for the Planet for children tree planters. And he was talking about the story of Richard St. Barbe Baker inspired him. And now this group has taken over the world, the United Nations tree planting program. And they're now planning on trying to plant 1 trillion trees. And they've already planted billions of trees through this program. So again, inspired by Richard St. Barbe Baker, and maybe achieving things that Baker was never able to do in his life because he was too far ahead of his time. So there's amazing things happening in tree planting. I love this story of in Ethiopia, these people set a record of planting 350 million trees in a day by mobilizing the whole country, giving them trees and sending them out tree planting. So yes, it was mentioned before that Jane Goodall wrote the introduction to the book. And I had an opportunity to talk to her, and she considered him one of her heroes, and he'd kind of paved the way for the environmental movement for figures like herself, had blazed a trail, and he was her hero, one of her heroes. Similarly with the Prince of Wales and his work, and he saw Baker as really this giant of the conservation movement who had sort of foreseen the environmental crises of today. And I love this quote of Abdu'l-Baha, and I think it really applies very well to St. Barbe Baker. And one of the things that I really admired about him is his perseverance. So here he is at his last tree planting. He happens to be in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan. That's Robert White behind him, he's now confined to a wheelchair. There's his walking stick from the Kiama in Kenya that he's still holding. He's, kind of on his last legs. But I was actually at that tree planting, and he was wheeled up, and he got up out of his wheelchair, and joined hands with all the little children, and they planted this tree and blessed the tree. And the next day he died in Saskatoon, and he's buried in Saskatoon. So this quote, "The honor and distinction of the individual consists in this, that he among all the world's multitudes should become a source of social good. Is any larger bounty conceivable than this, that an individual looking within himself should find that by the confirming grace of God, he has become the cause of peace and well-being, of happiness and advantage to his fellow man. No, by the one true God, there is no greater bliss, no more complete delight." And I think St. Barbe personified that objective of Abdu'l-Baha. And again, this beautiful quote from Abdu'l-Baha about the potential of the earth becoming like a Garden of Eden. And of course, St. Barbe was working on this, and we see so many examples today of positive change, like this beautiful photograph of agroforestry, agroecology, and new ways of looking after the planet. We mostly see negative things, but there's so many that are beautiful. So I'll end with this. The Lord of all mankind hath fashioned this human realm to be a Garden of Eden, an earthly paradise. If, as it must, it findeth its way to harmony and peace, to love and mutual trust, it will become a true abode of bliss, a place of manifold blessings and unending delights. Therein shall be revealed the excellence of humankind. Therein shall the rays of the Sun of Truth shine forth on every hand. So I think we can have hope, and the story of people like Richard St. Barbe Baker and what they accomplished in their life, how they inspired others and built capacity in others, I think is really instructive to us. And I hope that you captured a bit of that sense of hope today. And I'll just, yes, oh, I've got a little clip here, just a very short one, of Baker talking. Just a few seconds, and just to get you a taste of what he was like. Oops. Make it up. There we go.
People sometimes ask me, if you had to start your life all over again, what would you do? I think the answer is the same, exactly the same. I would start as a child in my father's nurseries, helping him to raise tens of thousands of forest trees. And today, there's even a greater need in the world. It's a question of planting trees for survival.
So just a little taste of St. Barbe. If you want more of his story, as Robert said at the beginning, there's a couple of books that I've done on him. And this, the new children's book, there's a discount code you can get to get that. But that gives you the whole story, but you don't have to spend a long, long time reading it if you don't want to get the full story. And if you want to share this with children, it's sort of aimed at a junior youth audience, and people are enjoying it. So thank you so much. I will stop sharing this screen, and I think we're going to have time for chat, questions.
Yeah, very definitely. Thank you so much, Paul. You moved me nearly to tears. It's just such a beautiful story. It's so inspiring, really. Such an incredible dedication and focus on such an important subject for everyone all around the planet. And I really appreciated the chance to see this and to remember my own brief encounter with Richard St. Barbe Baker when he told us about when he was a child. He was on the knee of William Booth, the founder of the
Salvation Army.
Salvation Army. Yes, so he even met Booth when he was a boy. So we have he really had quite an interesting, really amazing life.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are trying to raise their hands, but I think that usually would work if we were to turn on your microphone and camera, and we're not doing that. So if you have questions, put them either in the chat or the Q&A by typing them. We already have 12 comments in chat and 6 in the Q&A, and we'll see if we can get to as many of those as we can. So turning now to the chat, someone noted Mark Toby was also in one of those pictures. I think in the back row on the right is I think might have been him. I saw someone there, and I kept thinking, who is that? Who is that? And I think that might have been the person. Someone has put the 20% offer also in the chat, so if people want to find that information, it's there. Moving on down here. Someone says, later on, tell us about your work in Molokai. So we'll perhaps be able to get to that as well. My daughter is reading your book for a school book report right now. Thank you for writing a children's version of the story of St. Barbe Baker's amazing life story.
I see there's a question and answer box too, and there are some
Yes.
questions in there.
Yes, I'm getting to that right
Okay.
now as well. Beth says, are those conditions totally environmental, or are they caused by corporations using environmental hostile practices? I'm not sure which conditions she's referring to, which particular presentation you made.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's usually a combination of things going on. I mean, if she's talking about the Sahara Desert, it's naturally a dry area, a very sensitive area, and so natural climate change patterns and so on would be a factor, but it makes it very sensitive. And my understanding is that like the Sahara was once much more. It had more forest and more productive lands and so on. And it was the Romans came into North Africa and did a lot of farming there to support their homeland back in Italy and their empire. And that was part of the destructive process. And then next came the Arabs with their sheep and goats and so on. There was cutting down forests for trees for shipbuilding, and the sheep and goats prevent the forest from recovering. So these are all factors along with sort of natural dry cycles and so on that exacerbated. And so I don't think we can blame corporations, because I don't think there were any corporations until later on. But empire definitely was a big factor. Imperialism was a big factor. And then later the corporations would start, logging companies and so on would start working in Africa. So yeah, I think a combination of things.
Population pressure too, I suppose, would be another way of putting it. I understand in Japan, as far back as the 16th century, the emperor had to start limiting deforestation and encourage reforestation in Japan because people were cutting the trees down too fast. So there was actually imperial policies to protect the forests that far back because of the population. Because both those days, of course, they used firewood for everything. They couldn't import coal or anything. Back over to the chat, one person says, after reading Man of the Trees, I couldn't help but imagine his life being made into a movie. Have you any thoughts about this?
I think people have thought about that, and maybe someday that it could be good. There are a number of documentaries about him that some of them are available. If you'll find them on YouTube, there was one done in New Zealand, one done in Australia, and actually there's a Canadian filmmaker, Christopher Chapman, who won an Academy Award, was making a film about him. It's never completed, but in St. Barb's archives are at the University of Saskatchewan, and his film is in there, the work that he did do. So you actually could create an interesting, or a really good documentary using all this historical footage. But I think, a feature film could be very exciting. His work in Africa and so on would be potentially a great film.
One person asks, Margot asks, who was the one woman in the World Forestry Charter meeting? Do you know?
Well, unfortunately, I'll bet you it was a secretary at that time. Oh, by the way, I should mention that the Men of the Trees, it still exists, but it changed its name, fortunately, to the International Tree Foundation. Still active, still planting trees. I think they planted almost 1 million trees in Kenya in the last few years, and they're planning a big project to mark the 100th anniversary of the Dance of the Trees, 1922, with tree planting. So International Tree Foundation, you can find their, online, their link if you want to support their work.
One person here, Larry, asks, since Shoghi Effendi was a life member, is the Universal House of Justice now a member?
Well, I don't know if they joined organizations. I doubt it. But I did have a very interesting conversation with a member of the House of Justice, David Hoffman. And David Hoffman was the founder of George Ronald, the publisher. And he was a roommate of Richard St. Barbe Baker's. So one of the things I had an interview with him. He came to Saskatoon once after he was retired from the House of Justice, and he said one of the things I wanted to sort of delicately ask him is, are St. Barbe Baker's stories actually true? Because there's so many incredible stories. Because serendipity was kind of like his bread and butter, or his stock and trade. I don't know what his currency maybe, and so many serendipitous things happen. And David Hoffman, who I consider a very reliable source, said, well, he said, I often wondered that, but because, one of the things St. Barbe would always do would be dropping names. Yes, I met with this king and that king and president, and did he really? And he said, one day at our apartment, there was a knock on the door, and I went to the door, and it was a representative of President Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, who had sent Baker like a box of things from Africa, like treats and so on. So he said, oh, okay. It gives a little legitimacy to the stories. And then he told another really fascinating story. David Hoffman was one of the first television broadcasters in the world. And I didn't realize the BBC had a TV station, I think in the 1930s in Britain. It was like way before. I don't know if anybody had TV sets, but he had a TV program, and he had Richard St. Barbe Baker on. It was during, Baker had written a book called African Drums, and it was during an unusual drought that occurred in London, and jokingly, David Hoffman said, well, why don't you he had a rain stick or something. He said, why don't you use this to make it rain? And so Baker chanted and played and stuff. And he said, by the time he left the studio, it was raining. So again,
proves the serendipity.
I wouldn't believe such a story, but I think he's an impeccable source.
That's a good story.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Somebody noted the current Texas freeze disaster offers a new opportunity to replant palm trees.
Oh.
I suspect that's probably true. Janet wanted to sing the song St. Barbe taught when he planted a tree the day before he passed. I was there too and became a Baha'i through him. Quote, from our hearts with our hands for the earth, all the world together. Yeah. Unquote. Children put hand on heart and then on earth and then joined hands as they sing.
That's true. I think I'll refrain from singing it, but it was a beautiful thing he did with all the children. And if you go to his film, I think from the New Zealand Film Corporation, you can find online. Actually, they do that together with the children in that film.
That's very nice. One person asked, Daniel asks, is tree planting viable in the Western U.S.?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know what sort of the background of that question is, but definitely, sure.
I suppose there's some places that might be a little too dry, but then there are plenty of places that aren't.
It's actually amazing what people can accomplish. I want to recommend another film called Hope in a Time of Climate Change, which is about land restoration in China using reforestation techniques. And if you go there, you'll see, totally devastated lands restored through tree planting. So this is all feasible.
Carrie says, could you talk a bit about the notion of tree planting as a prophetic act? I guess she says page 89, so I guess this is a reference to something in your book.
Oh my goodness. A prophetic act. I'm not sure what that means. I think that if you go into the book of Revelations in the Bible, there's a lot of the vision of St. John, the vision of the future, involves a lot of tree planting in these cities that have all these avenues of trees and so on. And so I think it's prophetic. I often think of, in the Baha'i writings, that the tree of life is the manifestations of is a name of the manifestations of God. And so I think the divine physician is a tree planter in a sense, is encouraging us to transform our physical world as well as our inner lives. And one of the quotes that always inspires people about environment is Shoghi Effendi talks about how our outer world is a reflection of our inner world. And by changing our inner world, we can change the outer world. And so, yeah, I think there is a definite relationship between these spiritual stories, mythologies, and so on that include prophecies and the practical work of restoring the earth. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen by magic. Like, I think a lot of our mythological ideas or some conceptions of Christianity and so on believe that this will just happen. We won't have to do the work. But in the Baha'i teachings, it's kind of up to us, with the help of divine assistance, to make these changes in the world.
Yep. One person, some people were thanking you again, and one person notes the book Child of the Trees is substantive, and the large print also makes it great for senior readers, which is very true. Thanks, Paul, for that note.
Yes.
David and Rennie say, what was your original inspiration for starting a book about him?
I think it was meeting him. He was an incredible, is the word raconteur? Like, he could tell stories like you wouldn't believe. And they were so inspiring that, and he had a style, he had the pauses, and he could really tell the stories. And it was inspiring to be around him and to realize that an individual could really do so much in their lifetime to inspire others. And so, yeah, when I met him, I was fascinated by him. And I guess I always had it in my mind to do something, and eventually pulled it off. Fantastic. Yeah, it was exciting to get, I don't know if people know Hugh Locke, but Hugh has worked with St. Barbe Baker in the last years of his life and supported his work. And he was able to connect with Prince Charles, who is the patron of the Men of the Trees, the International Tree Foundation. And he had met St. Barbe Baker a number of times, was very impressed with him. And to have him endorse the book and so on was great. And also Jane Goodall, I was really surprised, how close her connection was with St. Barbe. She never met him, but she had read his books and was very inspired by his life story.
Huh. Carrie says this, what was the source of his extraordinary energy level during his lifetime? Vegetarian, fitness, prayer? What do you think?
Probably all of the above. Yeah, I think he was very much sustained by the Spirit. I'll tell you a story I didn't put into the book because it sounds a bit too woo-woo, but I believe he was in Iran. This is before the revolution. He was in Iran, and he would travel in Iran and meet with the Baha'is and support tree planting and so on. But they asked him to go to Shiraz, where the house of the Bab. And for people who aren't Baha'is, the Bab is one of the co-founders of the Bahá'í Faith. And they still had his house in Shiraz, and there was an orange tree that he had planted in the courtyard. And apparently this tree was dying. So they sent St. Barbe Baker to fix this tree. And St. Barbe Baker was very elderly already. And I guess when you go to the house of the Bab, you have to walk through these little narrow streets, and you can't drive there. And he had to be carried. He wasn't well enough to walk. So he went in, and they sat him by the tree, and he watched for a long time. And he noticed every pilgrim came in and watered the tree. And he realized that it was getting too much water and it was destroying its roots. So he said you just have to stop watering it so much and give it compost and, so on and so forth. And then St. Barbe Baker was a tree hugger. He was the original tree hugger. And so he went over to the tree and he would embrace the tree, and he embraced the tree of the bob. And he said it was like an electric shock went into him.
Huh.
And he was able to walk out from the house back to the car without any assistance.
Huh.
And he told me that story. I heard him tell that story, and so it sounds pretty far out there, but he talked about many times. He actually had 5 near-death experiences in his life where he died and was brought back, and he felt that he was brought back to because he had this mission that he had to accomplish in his life, and many illnesses and so on that he would recover from. Yeah.
Wow. Now, I wonder how many trees there are today descended from that original orange tree in the courtyard, because people would take the seeds.
Yeah.
I think I have 2.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah. Well, actually, I have mine and have somebody else's because they weren't around. One person asked a little more about Wangari Maathai and her fight for the environmental responsibility and democracy in Kenya for over 35 years. And how much did he know her? Do you know anything?
Yeah, well, they did meet, and people often say was she inspired in her work by him, and because basically she was doing the same thing through the Greenbelt movement and the women farmers of Kenya to use trees, to replant trees and so on. But she wasn't initially inspired by him, but she was aware of him, and I had a slide of him and her together doing this tree planting at the first World Conference on Desertification. And of course, she was imprisoned and so on for her work supporting women, and she became a minister in the government at one point and received the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. And as one of the slides was her daughter, Wanjira, who's now the head of that movement, did credit St. Barbe for being there first, so to speak, with those concepts of grassroots tree planting.
Sort of 2 related questions here. One wanted to know whether he did work specifically on agroforestry. And the other question from Janet, can you share some more of the key scientific insights that Richard started to illuminate, such as the connection between forest cover and water table and climate cycle, these kinds of issues?
What was the first question again?
Its connection with agroforestry.
Yeah, well, I guess agroforestry can mean different things, but I think starting in Nigeria in the mid-20s, he was promoting a new type of farming. People were doing the slash and burn type of agriculture, and he was promoting a different type where you would go in and maybe go into one of these slash and burn areas and plant trees, and the trees would grow up and eventually provide you with food and lumber and so on. But in the midst of the trees, while they were growing, you could grow your crops, and the trees would also help protect from erosion, wind erosion, and so on. And importantly, there, I guess they would really help to capture dew, which would give extra moisture. So he developed a system, and we talk about it in the book. Igi Oko, I think it was called. It was very similar to what you might call agroforestry, agroecology, permaculture, and so on today. So yeah, there definitely is kind of his roots. But there's also a type of maybe agroforestry that involves large-scale tree planting for lumber of monocultures and so on that he didn't approve of. And the other question was some of the scientific things that he was involved in. I think he saw, interestingly, I think before a lot of people, he saw a real link between forestry and climate. And he could see how deforestation was affecting climate, and sort of started speculating about a global climate change that would be affected by deforestation, desertification around the world. So there was that. And then he said a forest is a community of living things, the greatest of which is a tree. So he realized that forests are more than trees. And he understood the kind of the life of the soil, which people are really starting to understand now, like how trees actually communicate through the fungal systems growing in the soil, and they can send chemical messages through this kind of, somebody called it the wood wide web. And so there's a lot of scientific work now being done on this. And he realized that in indigenous spirituality in different places, these concepts were very familiar, and now they're being kind of proven out by scientific research as well. Yeah, and water, all of these things. He was very big on watershed management, and he was very against dams. Damming up waterways, except for maybe small dams and so on. So yeah, he did a lot of work in those areas.
It seems to me that one would characterize him more an activist than a scientist. He wasn't writing scientific papers as much as he was going around encouraging people to plant trees, maintain forests, and recognize the importance of forests in the overall picture.
Yeah, I think that's true. He did write 30 books, and all of them about trees. And one of them is Green Glory, which is sort of a survey of the forests of the world. And so I don't know if I'd call it really a scientific book, but yeah, I think that most of his things are more in the area of activism, discourse, and encouraging people to take action. He did a lot of work he was never a person who had much money, but at times he, in addition to selling some books, he did private work consulting with some of these aristocrats that he had in his group, and he'd do forest plans for them and that kind of thing. So he did do some work in those areas.
Interesting. Robert quotes this, I guess, maybe from your book, regarding the issue of being prophetic. Quote, "The simple act of planting a tree, which is in itself a practical deed, is also the symbol of a far-reaching ideal, which is creative in the realm of the spirit, and in turn reacts upon society, encouraging all to work for the future well-being of humanity rather than for immediate gain."
Yeah, that's beautiful. Isn't there some story about Abdu'l-Baha, and told a story about somebody who was planting trees, and the king came along or something and found this old man planting the tree, and the king said, "Why are you planting a tree? I mean, what good will it do to you now? You're already old." And he said, "Well, before I was born, somebody planted these trees for me. Now I'm doing the same." And the king said, "Well, it brings you no profit." And he told the king the story about, people had planted before, and the king gave him a bit of money, and he said, "See, it's already brought me some money."
Huh.
But,
Have you
that's
found,
a beautiful quote.
That's a good, have you found any connection between St. Barbe and Bill Mollison?
That I don't know if they ever met. Bill Mollison was kind of the founder of the permaculture movement. I mean, permaculture has always been there in different cultures, but I guess Mollison kind of modernized it. And I don't know. Robert White's on. I see on here. Robert White knew St. Barbe very well. I don't know, and is involved with permaculture, so maybe he'll know. If he knows the connection, he can type it in there.
Kathy says, "I live in the UK. I'm wondering where the forest is, or maybe was by now, that St. Barbe went to as a child."
he was from, oh my, I always forget these names. I have to read my own book to see where he was born, but it's in West End, which is in Hampshire, I think. Let me just, yeah. And so it was just the forests around their home there in West End. Maybe you know where West End is.
And another person asked, I guess, regarding forest agriculture. Agro-silviculture, I guess, is another term that is used for that particular thing. And Paul mentions this, I don't know what he's referring to, the story of inventing caravans.
Oh, yeah.
Travel trailers is fascinating. What's this story about?
Well, that was a whole other thing that he did. So after the war, he was a soldier. Military is a big thing in his life, too. So he was a soldier in the First World War, and that's where he had his first near-death experience, because he was wounded in an explosion.
Wow.
And they thought he was dead, and when they were pulling off his dog tags, I guess he started bleeding, and they realized he was still alive, and he recovered. But anyway, after the war, he wanted to go to finish forestry school and needed money. So he decided, he actually had a dream, and he saw we call them vacation trailers in North America, but they call them caravans, I guess, in England. And he had a dream of this caravan, and he saw the whole thing, kind of the design of this whole thing, and decided to go buy used aircraft, scrapped aircraft equipment, and build these trailers. He was a master carpenter too. So he would fit out these trailers and sell them and earn money to finish his education. But he wasn't that good of a businessman. He wasn't that good with money, and he didn't patent the idea or anything. But apparently Hugh Locke looked into this, the history of this, and found that he was, he went in, there's a caravan society and so on, and he went in, and they did credit St. Barbe with one of the first caravans, which somebody else made a whole bunch of money on.
Huh, interesting. Yeah, Robert White has replied. He says, when I did permaculture with Bill Mollison in 1981, he said he knew St. Barbe.
Okay.
So he did. He did know him. Running out of questions here. Kathy Gilman, who was wondering where in the UK, I guess did some research, is the New Forest in Hampshire.
Yeah, I remember now. Then he talked about the New Forest. And, yeah.
Good.
But I think the New Forest is a very, very old forest. But it's called the New Forest.
Well, it was new 500 years ago,
yeah,
so it's been called the New Forest since then, probably.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions right offhand, but you can see what a rich topic this has been, and it's generated really quite a lot of interest. Lots and lots of people with their comments and questions, but also a lot of people thanking you very much for this presentation today, Paul, which I certainly found fascinating as well. Here's one more. When St. Barbe married Catriona, and moved to New Zealand, did he really anticipate he would retire?
Well, in his, going through his books and papers and stuff, he talks about thinking he would retire to the farm. And so Catriona had a like a family farm, a ranch, and he kind of retired there to write books and so on. And he was going to be in charge of the gardens and I think was building compost heaps and all this kind of thing. But I don't think he could stand it for very long. And as I said, he went on this big famous ride across New Zealand on horseback and then started traveling again. And every year he would, I think basically in the northern winter, he would go back to New Zealand and spend a few months there with his wife. And then he'd leave and go traveling again and traveling to all these locations and giving talks and so on. So yeah, he claimed to be wanting to retire, but he couldn't handle it. So he had another 20 years in him,
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Milani asks, what's happening in Hawaii? What are your plans in Molokai?
Well, our plan is this, I'm learning that the best thing to do here is be a student and see what you can learn about local culture. They had, I'm read about their agroforestry, their permaculture type of farming that they had here before the imperialists arrived. And it was really, really extraordinary. Some of the most sophisticated agriculture anywhere in the world. It would run through valleys and different types of farming systems going down right to the ocean, where they built out fish ponds into the ocean. And the small amount of nutrients that would come from this watershed would nutrify this fish pond just to the right level, add a certain amount of fresh water. They got it just right, so it would be just loaded with fish, and fish could come in but couldn't get out. And they had an amazing agricultural system, which has kind of been destroyed by ranching and pineapple growing and sugarcane and all of these things. But people here are really working hard to restore the fish ponds, and it's quite exciting to see that happening. So I'm hoping to learn. I'm starting to grow gardens in my yard, and have to kind of work with a different type of soil and different types of plants and so on. So it's all very exciting. And yeah, just sort of getting acculturated and getting to know people, and hopefully I can be of some support to the work that they're doing here.
Very good. Well, Paul, thank you very much for this fascinating program today. We really are very grateful for this glimpse into the life of Richard St. Barbe Baker. And we wish you luck with all of your upcoming projects. No doubt some more books are coming at some point, and perhaps we'll be able to come see Molokai sometime and see the restored agriculture that people are working on, because that's always a very, very important effort as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Delighted, and we're looking forward to hearing you again sometime, and remind everybody that you should come back in another month to hear Najati Alkan talking about Abdu'l-Baha. Meanwhile, I hope everyone has a good weekend and a good week and a good month, and we look forward to seeing you again.